Hello and welcome to another episode of the Express Economist. This week, we'll be talking about unemployment and employment numbers in India. As many of you perhaps would have read that in the past 2 months, this issue of unemployment has sort of got into a lot of news because first the Prime Minister's office talked about creating 10 lakh jobs in the government in a mission mode. And then recently we saw Bihar's newly minted state government also talk about providing 10 lakh jobs. We've also seen visuals of a lot of young Bihari youth, sort of on the street, which they have been protesting for a while, asking for jobs, and most of their attention is sort of focused on government jobs. So the point is that this issue of unemployment is sort of getting back into news, although from a perspective of just tracking the data, one would say that since 2016-17 onwards, there's been a lot of news about unemployment being very high in India. So, to make sense of what is the state of unemployment in India, how good or bad or manageable it is, where do the solutions lie? In this week's episode, we'll be talking to Radhicka Kapoor, who's a senior visiting fellow at ICRIER. Hi, Radhicka. Welcome to the Express Economist.
Thank you.
And let's kickstart off the discussion with a question that sort of comes up again and again when we talk about unemployment, is that people can't agree with what is the level of unemployment in India. It seems like there is always this competition between which is the right level of unemployment. Some people would say my data set is correct, or one data set is correct, the other will point to another data set. So if you could tell our viewers, first of all, where to look for in data for unemployment and how to make sense of those data sets. Are they comparable, not comparable? What do they tell?
Okay, so principally, Udit, in India, we have been getting key labor market indicators from the NSS's unemployment surveys, which have been conducted since 1972. And these were conducted quinquennially, which is like once in 4 to 5 years. And in 2017-18, they changed the frequency with which they came out with the surveys. And these were conducted annually. So the NSS's unemployment survey was replaced with what we call the periodic labor force survey in 2017-18. And essentially, it's more or less the same questionnaire as the old survey. It just is a little shorter because it now comes out with annual frequency. And that has what has been the principal source of employment and unemployment statistics in India. Now, more recently, a private agency, CMIE, has also been conducting household surveys, which have been widely reported, in tracking the labor market indicators in India. Now, what CMIE has, of course, been conducting these surveys since 2016. And as you mentioned, people tend to cite both these surveys. There's a little bit about confusion about, what is right, what is wrong. And I think that to answer that question, it's best to explain how conceptually these two surveys are different. And then, you can take it from there to see, what is the question that interests you, what is the relevance for you, and then you see which data you want to look at. Now, basically, the key question that we're interested in is whether people are employed or unemployed and whether they're in the labor force or they're not in the labor force. Now, when we ask this question of people in a survey, we do it vis-a-vis a reference period. Now, what the NSS surveys do and what they have been doing since they started in 72, 73 is that they report your activity status based on 3 different reference periods. And this is something which was, carefully thought through. There was a committee formed, which was the famous Dantwala committee, which said that we should be looking at all these 3 reference periods. So one was called the usual status, where we ask people that what has been your activity status over the last year. The second is the weekly status, where we look at a reference period of a week. And the third is a current daily status, which is a little nuanced, where we basically look at their daily activities. We track their daily activities and then get a measure of employment or unemployment. Now, what the CMIE survey does is something a little different. What it says is that it asks people, what was your employment status today, as in the day the survey is happening, or the day before that? And then you have to tell them whether you're employed, whether you're unemployed, willing to work and looking for work, or you're unemployed, you're willing to work but not looking for work, and then whether you're unemployed and not willing to work and not even looking for work. Now, because the reference period vis-a-vis which we are asking these questions is so different and it's not comparable in the two surveys, one cannot expect to get similar answers. Now, some have argued that the CMI's measure is the closest to the NSS's current daily status. And yes, it appears on the face of it to be the closest metric. But having said that, the current daily status measure, which is derived in the NSS surveys, is very nuanced, where we look at not just one day, we actually look at the activity status of a person for an entire week. We divide every day into two equal parts. We say, whether you work for half day, full day, and based on a series of calculations, we then arrive at this measure of employment and unemployment. So the point is that even the CDS measure is not actually completely comparable to the CMIE data. So the point that I would flag is that when you are drawing comparisons between these two, you have to remember that conceptually, they're very different in terms of the reference period over which we are asking people about their employment status. So we're not going to get the same answer. Having said that, of course, if one, while in absolute terms, you might not find similar answers, but generally when we look at trends, and the PLFS data, of course, comes with a lag, we do broadly find the trends to be pretty comparable. The second thing I want to flag is that basically the CMIE data is a panel data set, which means that you go to the same household every wave. So what the CMIE survey does is that over the year, it conducts a survey in 3 different waves, and each wave is of 4 months. And in every wave, it goes back to the same household. So it's a panel data. Now, over time, it's possible that because you're going to the same household, you're doing a panel, the panel becomes less representative over time. The PLFS, however, does not track the same household over time. It's only in the urban percentage of households are tracked repeatedly and where you have a rotational panel sampling design. But given these 2 key differences, to my mind, I think we should not try and compare too much what is right, what is wrong. And now, of course, there have been a lot of discussions about the sampling design of the CMI, which is very new. And that's probably a topic of discussion for another day. But these are the 2 concepts I want to highlight before you start doing these comparisons.
Yeah. So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is that first thing is PLFS and CMIE should not be compared. You should not use one day of PLFS and then CMIE over the same period or of another period. That would lead to very spurious results. The second thing you're saying is that they differ in terms of the reference periods and who they go to in terms of checking this data. So they're not comparable in that sense. So would it be correct to say that if we are talking about unemployment, people should either stick to CMIE or PLFS in trying to come to any conclusion, whether the unemployment level or employment trends are improving or worsening? Is that the correct way to go about?
Well, like I said, firstly, the CMIE is of fairly recent origin. It starts only in 2016. And, given that the sample design is very different, it's a panel. If one wants to look at aggregate trends over a long period of time, the PLFS would be the PLFS/NSS employment unemployment surveys, which have now been happening for decades, would be the place to go to. But having said that, I should also point out that, the CMI data set being a panel, and given the fact that it also, besides the employment status, it is also collecting information on a lot of other key economic variables about the household, demographic characteristics. There's a lot we can understand in terms of what are the correlates of employment and unemployment. But in terms of tracking aggregate trends, the PLFS is where I look.
Okay, so I have 2 further questions. One is, and I think you mentioned a bit in the first answer, but if you could elaborate, are they telling the same story about India's employment scenario, or are they telling dramatically different stories? That is the first question.
So actually they don't tell you very different stories depending on which metric that you're looking at. If I, for example, look at the usual status measure from the PLFS and compare it with CMIE, I get very, different estimates. An example there is that, for example, if you look at the data in PLFS between 2018-19 and 19-20, we actually saw a decline in the open unemployment rate as per the usual status. And that was not because, a lot of employment was created, but it was because the usual status measure captures a lot of underemployed people, and there was a lot of distress in the economy. So people were doing whatever they could find, whatever work they could find. They were in the informal sector. There was disguised unemployment. But all of that resulted in a decline in the open unemployment rate in the PLF, right? But if you look at the CMIE numbers, you actually saw a very sharp increase in their unemployment rate. So one factor, like I said, you look at the reference periods and then draw your analysis. But nevertheless, I mean, there are certain trends which are corroborated, like, the CMI and PLFS both indicate, for example, that employment in agriculture has been increasing over the last few years, especially in the post-pandemic period. When you look at a lot of the key labor market indicators, particularly vis-a-vis males, they're somewhat comparable trends. In terms of females, the trends are different. The numbers are also starkly different. And there, of course, that partly plays out because of this reference period issue and the kind of activities that women are engaged in and the period over which they're engaged in those activities.
Right. So, if we could just look back, you've been tracking employment issue and the data for such a long time. Can you look back in the data and tell us what is the current state of unemployment in India? Is it very dire? Is it like the worst in 1 decade, 2 decades, 4 decades? Is the current level of unemployment or employment rate, whichever way we want to define it, one of the worst in the historical sense? Or, because I hear two different versions from people tracking this. One set says that, there is no unemployment problem in India. This level of unemployment was always there. We're just making too much about this. The other is looking at some other data maybe and saying that, we definitely are seeing a considerable stress building up. And often whether or not an issue becomes a political issue becomes the clinching argument, because it didn't become an election issue. It was perhaps not relevant. But what is the economic data telling you? Where are we in terms of unemployment, and is it manageable, or is it more than, higher than what we expect, in terms of a good level of, or an acceptable level of unemployment in the country?
So there are lots of questions in that question.
Sorry.
So let me take a more long-term view to answer this question, because obviously, over the course of the last few years, all the discussion around employment and unemployment has been in the backdrop of that 6.1% number that we saw in the PLFS in 2017-18. And, the way the discourse has evolved, it almost appears that it appears to a lot of people that this is actually a new problem in India. And so a lot of our judgment on the issue is clouded by this recency bias. But I think it's worth going back in time and looking at how this issue has evolved. And before I start explaining the trends, I think it's also important to highlight that, labor underutilization, which is the question that we're really interested in the labor market, can take various different forms. One is that you're actually unemployed, and the other is that you're underemployed. And in developing countries such as ours, where basically most people can't afford to remain unemployed, where we don't have unemployment insurance or other safety nets that give people the luxury of being unemployed, they're actually underemployed. So when you want to look at labor underutilization to get an accurate picture of the level of distress in the labor market, you need to look at both unemployment and underemployment. Now, if you go back to the data, and again, if you look at all the surveys starting from 1972-73, you'll basically see that the unemployment rate in India was, it was about close to 2%. It fluctuated between 2 and 3. And that was and I'm giving you the measure here as per the usual state. We can, have this usual current weekly status discussion after I explain these trends. But those numbers are basically telling you that the unemployment rate was, broadly in the range of 2 to 3%. And obviously on the face of it, it doesn't appear to be a cause of concern because it seems like what would be the unemployment rate in a developed economy. But beneath that metric, if you actually look at what people were doing, what you find is that principally almost 80% of the workforce was either self-employed or it was in casual work. And these are all, employment arrangements that enable work sharing and therefore capture a lot of underemployment in the economy. So the problem was not reflected in this open unemployment statistic or the unemployment rate, but there was this problem of underemployment, which was brewing in the economy back then. In fact, it's even before the NSS survey started. There is this article by Professor K. N. Raj, in the late 50s, where he points this issue out, and he says that there are 3 problems that he points out. His framework consists of 3 problems in the labor market. One is the problem of underemployment. The second is the problem of disguised unemployment. And the third is the problem of open unemployment, as in the unemployment as we are discussing it. And he points to the fact that all these 3 problems are present in the Indian economy even back then. Now, so one is that when we look at this open unemployment rate, we kind of conceal this problem of underemployment, which becomes evident only if we, scratch beneath the surface and we see what is it that people are doing. The fact that they're predominantly in the agricultural sector, the fact that they're predominantly in self-employment or casual work is reflected in that. But, even if you look at the open unemployment rate, which we are discussing right now, it's interesting to see that if you look at the youth, right? I mean, when we look at this unemployment rate of 6.1% or 4.8% as we see it in the new PLFS, that's for people in the 15 plus age. But if we look just at the 15 to 29 group, what we find is that in India, always, it is youth unemployment, which has been considerably higher, almost 2 to 3 times higher than what is the unemployment rate for the economy as a whole. And, the numbers have always, in 2018-19, that number was about 17%. But even if you go back to earlier surveys, it's about 2 to 3 times that of the unemployment rate for the working age group as a whole. In fact, we also did this exercise where we looked at the unemployed, the total unemployed, and we broke them down by their education, by their age, by their demographic characteristics. And what we found was that about 80% of those who are unemployed are actually young. And this goes back as far as 2000. So, the problem of a high open unemployment rate might not have been apparent because a lot of it was concentrated in the youth, which naturally got concealed in this aggregate number. However, over time, what has happened is that as the share of the youth has increased in our working age group, as the level of education, and again, it is the educated youth which have the highest unemployment rate within this youth category also, as their share in has increased, the unemployment rate as a whole is also increased. So in fact, a big part of the reason why we saw that huge jump in the unemployment rate between 2011, 12 and 17, 18 was because of this cohort of the educated youth. And there's actually a reason why this has happened, which again, we can discuss. But, this trend this problem has been brewing in the economy for a very, very long time. And again, to quote the same article, which I found very insightful reading in 2022, it seemed like it was talking about the labor market problems today and not in the 1950s. K. N. Raj also points out that the future of India will lie in the quality of jobs that are created for its youth. So not only do we need to create more jobs for our youth, but we have to create good quality, decent work for our youth.
When you talk about solutions, one thing is that it often shows up in this demand for government jobs, but Indian Express has carried a lot of stories, and I'm sure there are many other pieces of evidence that suggest that jobs in the government sector are not possibly the solutions. First of all, they are not going up. Even last year, when India grew at almost 9%, jobs actually in the government sector came down. We were looking at the data from the biggest government companies by market capitalization, and the total jobs fell. So one is that. Secondly, even if what government was to, in a jiffy fill all the vacancies that they have, even that number I don't think is going to be enough to perhaps deal with the kind of problem of unemployment we're talking about, the stress that is there. So where do the solutions lie in the economy? Because business as usual, it seems like the stress will continue, and with every passing year, we'll just have more unemployed, especially in the youth age group. So if you could reflect a bit about, in terms of solutions, what are the 1, 2, 3 things that you think we should do?
So let's start with the role of the government, because that's something which is, obviously got a lot of attention in recent times. Principally, it's not the job of the government to create jobs, but it is the job of the government to create an enabling environment for the private sector to grow and expand and therefore create jobs. Having said that, let's also remember that we are at a, post-pandemic, we are at a very critical juncture. The severity of the crisis has increased enormously. And the most worrying thing to my mind is the fact that, India's structural transformation, which was sluggish to begin with in the first place, has now in fact reversed. And what we've seen in the period between 1890 and 2021 is that the share of employment in agriculture has gone up by almost 4 percentage points. And that's not what we should be seeing in a developing economy, where the share of agriculture should be declining while that of manufacturing and services goes up. So therefore, I feel like maybe this is a time for us to rethink the role of the state in creating employment. And here, like you said, there is a limit to the number of jobs which can be created. Now, of course, there are vacancies, and the figure of 1 million, which was put out by the Prime Minister to hire people in central government departments in mission mode, it actually probably emanates from the fact that there have been some reports which suggest that there are about 8,70,000 vacancies in various central government departments, and these need to be filled up. And of course, if we were to add, state governments in various other departments and so on, that number would increase. So yes, some employment generation can happen over there. But of course, given that estimates suggest that India needs to create anywhere between 20 million and 200 million jobs, government jobs can clearly not make that dent. Nevertheless, I think it's an area where we need to work and see what is the best that we can do to fill up those vacancies, not just to create employment, but to actually enhance the efficiency of public services in India. Because there's another interesting statistic which has been put out by certain economists, where they look at the number of public employees per 1,000 population across the world. And India is actually very low on that number. We have 16 public employees per 1,000. For Brazil, that number is something like 110, and for the US, it's even larger. So to the extent that you need efficient delivery of public services to actually create a conducive investment climate for the private sector, I think we need to think about how we can enhance the number of public employees per 1,000. Now, I know when I say that, a lot of people say that this just encourages inefficiency and redundancy. So let me add this by saying that when I'm proposing this, I also feel we need to rethink public sector hiring, and we need to rethink how we can do the hiring in a way that actually enhances efficiency, productivity, most importantly, accountability of those public service providers within the same fiscal envelope. And that's perhaps something we should think about, given that we are at this very crucial juncture. We know that there's a lot of stress. We are at this point where, some people argue that demographic dividend is going to turn into a demographic disaster. So I think we need to pull out all stops and say, whether it's the government or the private sector, we have to do the best that we can. Again, in terms of the private sector, I think, yes, the thing has been that, we say that we need faster growth to create employment. But when we make that point, we essentially assume that employment is basically a derivative of the growth process. But we need to recognize that we need to pay more careful attention to the sectoral composition of growth. We need to focus on those sectors which are more employment intensive, which have the potential to create maximum employment, especially for many of the low and middle skill also, not just the high skilled and the high end services, because the low skill and the middle skill guys are the ones who are underemployed. So, paying more careful attention to that sectoral composition of growth, saying that, okay, these are the key sectors that we need to focus on, and let's do whatever we require, be it in terms of an industrial policy or a trade policy, to actually accelerate growth of those industries, or be it cluster development approaches, to accelerate growth of those sectors that can create employment is necessary. And so here, I would say that, industrial policy for giving a push to labor-intensive manufacturing is really quite important.
Is that last thing? We've heard, during the UPA time also, because 2004-5 was the start of a period when we saw a massive boost in growth. We saw a new policy for manufacturing and industrial, revitalizing the industrial sector. And we've also seen Make in India in the recent governments, since 2016. But none of that seems to be reflected in the jobs upspurt. So is there a problem here about the labor intensive thing that you talked about? Are we not doing that enough? It is one thing to say that let's do labor intensive, but are we doing that or not? Or do we need to seriously tweak that?
So, like the policies that you're talking about, be it the national manufacturing policy or the Make in India policy, these were policies which said that, look, we need to increase the share of manufacturing in GDP. We have to create 100 million jobs in manufacturing. They were not policies in the sense is narrowly defined, where we say that we're going to pick up specific sectors or specific industries and focus just on those. If you actually look at the policy documents of both of these programs or schemes, you basically, it's not as if it's a targeted approach towards any specific sector. They are talking about pushing manufacturing. Now, one dimension of this is that these things have come from the central government. Now, it is important to remember that for the manufacturing sector to grow, a lot of the factors that determine the investment climate, that will determine the industrial growth in a state, don't actually come from the center. So while it's great to have the central government actually put its weight behind manufacturing and acknowledging the importance of manufacturing in accelerating structural transformation and saying that, no, we can't just leapfrog from agriculture to services. We need to have that phase of manufacturing-led growth. It's also important to recognize that a lot of the real action is going to come at the state level. And that's what has been missing, it seems to me. And of course, the fact that these policies are not actually picked up sectors. The closest we've come to picking up sectors is actually the production-linked incentive scheme, which to my mind is actually, the sectors chosen are capital intensive in nature. The thought behind picking those sectors is not entirely employment driven. It's, it's also linked in terms of sunrise industries where we need India to be present in the future, that we're self-reliant and so on. But that's the closest we have come to picking up sectors. But labor-intensive sectors, to be fair, have not got their due in India's industrial policy framework. And here again, let me go back to the second five-year plan, and that, even back then when India was adopting an industrial strategy, the Mahalanobis strategy of industrialization was essentially about focusing on heavy industries. And of course, that was because, we wanted to, for the reasons of being self-reliant, which is, of course, a theme that we're coming back to at this point. But India felt that it needed to focus on building its capital good industries, and the wage goods industry could, happen later as a byproduct. And over there also, given that we were a capital scarce nation and our capital got diverted towards these very highly capital intensive industries, we didn't have much left for the growth of labor intensive industries. So we've actually not given labor intensive industries their due, despite the fact that, we are a labor abundant economy. And so labor intensive industries should have been our competitive advantage. And so even though we have a comparative advantage in labor, we haven't been able to convert that comparative advantage into a competitive advantage vis-a-vis our industries. And that has much to do with the nature of the policies that we followed over the years.
Very well put, Radhicka. Thanks for that. The point that you make, that we have a comparative advantage. India has a comparative advantage in labor, but we have not been able to turn it into a competitive advantage. And this has been the story right through for the last 75 years. I hope the viewers would have understood a couple of conceptual issues about when we talk about PLFS data or CMIE data, and why you should not just compare the two numbers casually. Also, what makes these surveys different, but more importantly, what is the situation in India? That when we talk about open unemployment rates, and somebody might say 3% or 2%, 8 or 9%, the story behind it is also crucially important, as Radhicka pointed out, that there's a lot of disguised unemployment. There's a lot of stress in the labor market, which doesn't always get captured. Also, that bulk of that unemployment related stress is for the youth of this country, and this is one area, this is one cohort which is sort of growing. This is all projections show that this is the group that is going to be bulging all for the coming period. So if we do not address this thing, we will not be able to deal with this problem, and the stress will continue. And in terms of solutions, it is, as she rightly pointed out, that government's job is not to give jobs. However, it has to look at its public employment, towards also from the perspective also of better delivery of public services. And then from the perspective of creating jobs or engendering a scenario for jobs in the private sector, look for labor intensive sectors, pick sectors, again, turn your comparative advantage into a competitive advantage through a right policy mix. Radhicka, thanks a lot for sharing your time and insights so generously with our viewers. Thanks for coming to the Express Economist. And to all the viewers, if you like this episode, please press like and subscribe, and we'll be back next Friday. Thank you.